everybody. Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and today we'll be talking about one of the most basic functions of an HR team, but one whose practices, at least according to our guest today, are wildly out of date. But honestly, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who disagrees with that. Of course, we are talking about recruiting. And while technology has added some nuance to the processes that we've been following for 50 plus years, it's definitely a time for all of us to re-examine how we go about hiring. We are joined today by Steve Lowisz. Steve is the founder and CEO of Qualigence International, a talent solutions provider. And he is also the author of Recruiting Sucks, but it doesn't have to. Breaking through the myths that got us here. Steve, we are so happy to have you here with us.
Glad to be here, Beth. Thank you.
So tell me, why does recruiting suck?
I think there's two reasons recruiting sucks. And one is it's focused often on the wrong things. And then the second piece is there's very little education around what recruiting really is. It's like anybody can do it by just picking up the phone or using LinkedIn or what have you. And there's no thought behind it at times. So I think there's two big issues as to why recruiting sucks.
If the recruitment systems are so broken, why are we still using them, do you think?
Well, I use myself as an example, right? So I'm probably 20 pounds overweight, give or take, depending on who you ask, right?
Okay.
Why don't I lose weight, right? I've tried. It's kind of a habit thing, right?
Yeah.
We're so used to doing it the way we've done it, even though it generally doesn't produce the right results. I know when I had ice cream last night, it was not good for me, but I continued to do it anyways.
Yeah, you're aware of the habit. It doesn't mean that awareness is going to bring about any change. You just know that it exists.
That's the issue. That's knowing and doing, you and I both know, are not the same thing. Not
They're
at all.
really not. Yeah. Do you think there are costs tied to using a broken system? What do you think our drivers are for change here, individually and organizationally speaking?
There are absolutely costs. Think about it this way. If we hire the wrong people, and we've heard this in studies, what's the cost? What's the negative cost internally by having the wrong person? Turnover, morale, lack of customer service, horrible efficiency. There's all kinds of problems that come out as a result of this, right? And when we think about the drivers for change, well, we got to create. So think about it. If I'm a recruiter, whether I'm internal or external, I am focused on, held accountable to what? To filling a number of roles. I am not held accountable to putting the right person in the right role for the right reason at the right time. Think about that. So we talk about, we got to have the right people. We got to fix recruiting. But if I'm held accountable to not quality, but I'm held accountable to numbers, I'm going to give more numbers.
Yeah, I have never thought about that breakdown, of course. And obviously, everybody would want quality over quantity, or I would assume that they would.
Well, we talk about that. We talk about we want quality candidates, quality of hire. But let's break it down to the simple. We do what we're measured against. Think about that in the work world. I don't care if you're an internal or an external recruiter. If I'm an internal recruiter, the numbers that are posted are how many positions did I fill and how long were the positions open. That's going to drive me to try to fill the lowest hanging fruit subconsciously. It doesn't matter if my intent is correct. My actions will be different because it's what I'm held accountable to. If I'm an agency recruiter and I'm getting paid a commission, whether it's retained or contingent, it's all about filling the role and going on to the next thing. I'm measured against numbers. I'm never measured against the quality and the impact of that person that I place.
Right. Just like the driving force there would just be the commission, right? Is that kind of the thought? Yeah. Well, it should be noted, too, for those that are listening, that you've experienced both sides of this broken process, both from the side of being the recruiter as well as from the side of being a recruitment customer. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I got into this business because I was on the receiving end of it, right? So at the time, I'm an architect by education, but I quickly moved into, so initially it was the building blocks of businesses, meaning the actual building blocks. I then made
literally.
Literally. And then I made the switch to the building blocks of business are people. But when I first made that switch, I was leading sales for an organization that did office equipment, high-speed printers, $100,000 pieces of equipment, right?
Wow.
And my job was to hire people. I had to hire the teams that provided both the sales and the service to our clients. My job was not to hire, although I was responsible for it, I'm supposed to be selling, but yet at the same time, I'm supposed to be recruiting. So I used agency recruiters. Nothing wrong with agency. Love agency. But the problem was they all had the same model. And I got really disappointed with the quality of the candidate. I got very disappointed with the process because it was like they were convincing me to hire somebody because they could get their commission, not because they were the right person. And when I asked them questions about a candidate, they were very surfacey to the point of they didn't even truly understand what made that candidate tick. That should be the role of the recruiter.
Yeah, well, you would hope that if you're going to have a recruiter, that they're looking out for the best interest of the company, not so much their pockets.
But why would they? Think about it. If they're
I know, I'm human. If you're going to tell me I'm going to get more money if I give you X, Y, and Z, then I'm definitely going to do X, Y, and Z because I am thinking about myself. But yeah, it's just ideal that they would also have maybe the same kind of care when recruiting for the company.
And I think the intent, there's good recruiters out there that focus on the right candidate. I don't want to, we've got to be careful about passing complete judgment. It's just that the overall experience, both that I had as a hiring leader, as well as most of the hiring leaders that I deal with, they're set up to fail because, again, the recruiters are incented by something else, whether there's an external recruiter or an internal recruiter, because we don't hold them to the performance of the candidate. We hold them to filling a rec. There's two very differences there, two big differences.
Yeah. So is all of what you just said, is that kind of what inspired you to write this book?
So all of that started me in the journey of this business, right? So I've now been in this business for more than 2 decades, okay? 25 years plus. That's what got me in the business. The book was actually an event that happened. So I do a lot of speaking around HR, leadership, and obviously recruiting. And I was heading down to Florida to speak at a conference. And I'm sitting next to a guy, and I'm a recruiter too. So what do? You start asking, what do you do for a living? And this was the CEO of a tier 1 automotive supplier in Detroit. That's where I'm from. He was getting ready to retire and was flying down to Florida to build his dream home, his retirement home. It was a 17,000 square foot condo, is the way he called it. Yeah. So
17,000 square foot condo?
Yeah. It was,
goodness gracious.
That was my reaction, but I didn't let it show. I continued to ask questions. And, we talked for about 30 minutes, and he finally turned to me and he said, "So what are you going down to Florida for?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to speak at a conference." And he says, "What kind of conference?" And I said, "Well, it's HR and talent acquisition." And we're literally sitting next to each other because this is before social distancing, right?
Yeah.
And he leans away from me and he goes, "Oh, you're one of them."
Now, what do you mean by that, sir?
So for the rest of the flight, we talked about his experience, which I heard a gazillion times before with recruiters, both internal and external, and even HR, because our HR recruiting reports up to HR and it's all part of the same team. And he kept going through these experiences over and over and over. And I thought, and his final comment to me was, generally recruiting sucks. That's where the title of the book was born from. And that's where the idea for the entire book came from.
Yeah. Well, it really grabs your attention. It makes you want to say, yeah, that's right. But what else? What else does Steve have to say about it?
Yeah, it's like, it sucks, but it really doesn't need to. I look at recruiting and HR like this. We're one of the most important pieces to any organization because we deal with the people. The people are the biggest piece to the success or a failure of 90%, 95% of the companies that are out there. We can either make a company successful or we can crush a company, depending on how we do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so recruitment is such an entrenched system. We all know that. And I'm not going to lie. It's overwhelming just to think about the idea of changing things up on a large scale. When you were writing the book, were you ever overwhelmed at just the scope of change needed to improve this system?
So, and I've been asked that question a gazillion times, and I've asked myself that same question. And the answer is no, but let me explain that. It's, as I wrote the book, and I think you've seen part of the book, or if not, have read it all, it's not rocket science. The concepts, the myths that I deal with in the book are simple, but not always easy. So implementing these changes is simple. They're basic. But the reality of getting people to change their habit that we talked about earlier, that's the part that's not easy.
All right, Steve, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break, but when we return, we'll talk a little more about those myths that you just mentioned, so stick around. Are you new to labor relations or working in HR and ta-da, now need labor relations skills? Today's sponsor, Union Proof Certification, has got you covered. Union Proof Certification is a comprehensive online course in labor relations that will help you get the knowledge you need to understand what's at stake, the language used by unions and attorneys, the resources available for assistance, and how you can turn a potentially frightening situation into a positive one. You can learn more at unionproof.com/certification. Learn years of labor relations knowledge at your own pace and earn 24 SHRM or HRCI credits at the same time. We're back with Steve Lowisz, author of Recruiting Sucks, But It Doesn't Have to, breaking through the myths that got us here. Steve, when we went to break, we mentioned myths surrounding recruitment practices. And this is actually what the book is structured around, shattering myths and putting better practices in place. Can you share with us some of these myths?
Yeah, happy to. In fact, in the book, I go through 6 basic myths. Our follow-up will have another 6, but I would really want to hit the first one that's there because it's so critical to the rest of this book. And it's this myth that skills are the most important thing. Let me quantify that because there's a lot of discussion around, it's not just skills, it's the soft skills, it's all these other things. But let's think about the process of recruiting all the way from the point of creating a job description. Look at a job description. What's listed in a job description? Skills, skills, skills.
More skills.
And education. That's the only thing that it's focused on. There's really, there's some competencies and some other stuff in there. But if we take that, we start with skills instead of really what we're trying to have the position accomplish. And we take that out to the market and we post our ads. It's about, I need somebody that has this experience, skills, skills. And it ties us into what we assume is the skill set of a person who can do the job. Does that mean that only one person with that one skill set is the only person that can create results in that job? The answer is no. It's been studied. It's not about just the skills. There's so much more to a candidate. If you're focusing the majority of your efforts on 1/3 of a candidate, which is what the skills are, you're missing the boat on the other 2/3.
That's huge. Yeah. Well, I got to say, the idea of not putting skills at the top of the list almost feels like a radical thought. I don't know why. Have you gotten much pushback on this?
Oh, yeah. I love it. I mean, there's this, we got to have people that have skills. Yes, I get that. But let's first focus on the results you need. And then we can talk about some of the skills we think they need to have. But let's start with the end in mind, not start off with, well, here's what we think it needs to be because somebody else who was in this role previously had these same skills. Doesn't mean a number 2 that looks exactly like that is the only one who can do it.
Well, I do love, too, that so much of your approach in your book with discovering the head and the heart, along with the skills, has to do with turning the, quote, candidate into an actual person.
Well, that's exactly what they are. Right? we sometimes make them a piece of paper, a set of skills, as we've already talked about, instead of understanding that there's so much more to a human being. Let's think about this here for a second. Our minds, let's say we have all the skills in the world, but our mind says don't use them. Are we going to be effective at that job?
No.
What if our heart is not in it? Does that mean we're going to use the skills or the thing that's in our mind? All these 3 things are tied together, but our recruiting process, our interview process, and 90% of the assessment processes are based on the skill and maybe a little bit of the soft skill, but not truly in uncovering what's in their head, what's in their heart, And then third, and only after those first two align, do we need to get into some of the skills-based things. If they don't have the other two, what's the point?
Is the part where you talk about focusing on the heart, does any of that have to do with passion? Like, do you want to know if the candidate is passionate about this type of work? Or what do you mean with the heart of the matter?
That's a great question, Beth. In fact, let's think about it. Everybody has certain drivers, right? Certain things that are important to them. It might be something personal, like it's just important to them to provide for their family. That's different than what's in my heart right now is to be the most successful in whatever business I am and get my name on a plaque and accolades. Those are two very different drivers that often come from the heart. Asking questions to understand what's important to the individual, not just from a mind perspective, but from a heart perspective, tells you a lot about that individual and do they fit within the culture and the context that you're trying to recruit them into.
Oh, that's great that you mentioned culture too, because that's got to be kind of a pivotal means of examining a candidate. Could they also fit into the culture along with everything else that we've just discussed?
Yeah, that's the first question when somebody brings up the term culture is, define for me what you mean by culture, because it's such an overused, ambiguous term. Does it mean that I fit into the culture of a manager? Does it mean that I fit into the culture of a organization? And if that's the case, define for me what culture means. And here's my take on this, Beth, is there's kind of two pieces to this, right? It's the culture of the manager means my fit with the manager means I do the work in a very specific way, not the actual technical pieces, but the way in which I show up to work, the way in which I communicate, the way in which I interact or don't interact. That builds the culture of that particular hiring leader. It's the same thing for a company, but it's much more complicated. Do I fit the overall culture of the company, meaning the way that I do the work, the way that I do show up, don't show up, the way that I interact, and so on? That one's a lot tougher to figure out because there's so many people involved in it.
Yeah, I bet. Can you tell me about the results-based interviewing in the core four?
Yeah, so this actually ties into some of what we're talking about, because if we do recruiting and we do interviewing the way we've always done it, the habit we've always had, we have a tendency to ask questions that don't matter, or we focus on things like skills because it's the most tangible and it's the easiest. Results-based interviewing completely blows that out of the water and says this. Think about it this way, and I referenced this earlier. What we want is to uncover people who can do the objective, that can deliver on the objective of the position, not on the objective like you'd see on a job description, but on the measurable objective that the hiring leader actually wants, which means if you go all the way back before the job description, we have to focus on understanding what specifically does the hiring leader want this person to accomplish in a measurable way. Results-based interviewing then takes that and leverages the principles of the core four, basically four different pieces: head, heart, skills, and then the last one are the questions, the four sets of questions to figure out those first three. So it's a very defined process that starts first with results, which is why it's results-based interviewing, determines if they can deliver then on that, then goes into what's in their head, what's in their heart, and ultimately what's in their skills. So it turns the interview process completely on its head.
Yeah, I like that method. That's very intriguing. Are these the four questions that you asked that you just mentioned, are they the same every time, or are they unique to, every single company depending on what they need and want?
The structure has to stay the same. So the overall four pieces. So if you think about it, we've got results-based interviewing, which is created by the core four, the principles of the core four, and looking at what's, again, results first, kind of the second piece, what's in their head, the third piece, what's in their heart, and then the fourth piece, those skills, and then those open-ended questions. The question structure will remain consistent. The way in which you ask the question should change based on the individual and the role that you're recruiting for. But if you vary from the structure, the success rate drops.
I'm curious if you've heard from LinkedIn at all. They are your myth number two, after all, although you were very kind to them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so no, first of all, I have not heard directly from them. I did receive an email from somebody who I know that works there, but it wasn't on behalf of LinkedIn.
Okay.
And let me explain the myth is LinkedIn is the end all be all for recruiting. And we're all think about the challenges with that, right? All of the recruiters, if that's the only tool we use, we're all fishing in the exact same pond. So that's a negative. Positive is we have access to hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, which
Right.
is incredible. But the way we leverage it ends up making us lazy. So let's think about it. One, if that's all we're using, again, I've got same access to everybody else. What sets me apart as a recruiter? Okay. Number two, if we use it as a glorified database, which is all that most recruiters use it for, eventually the database dries up because only so many new people are being added to it on a consistent basis.
Yeah.
And as a recruiter, it makes me lazy. And so I'm not using some of the other tools or methods or groups or so on that I could be using to really get to the best candidate.
Yeah.
I am not suggesting you can't find the best candidate on LinkedIn. I'm suggesting is we use it the wrong way.
Yeah. And it's very saturated.
Oh, sure. And think about their model. And look, I give them a lot of credit for what they've
Sure.
created,
Of
right? I mean, the
course.
most active group on LinkedIn is recruiters. Number one. Number two, salespeople, right? So
Hmm.
awesome, awesome, awesome. But here's the thing. The model is such that when you do a keyword search within LinkedIn, it continues to give you different results for the exact same keywords. Why is that? They want you to keep coming back to the platform over and
Oh,
over and
yeah.
over.
Yep.
So are you really going to find everybody every time you do that search? Of course not. It doesn't even work on Google.
Yeah. Seems like we need a little more there.
Well, that leads into, I mean, I'll mention one other myth because my myth number three is recruiters don't need to be marketers. And this is what I mean by that. You said the word saturated. LinkedIn is saturated. It is saturated by recruiters. It is saturated by salespeople, all pushing out the same message. Have I got the opportunity for you? This is a wonderful opportunity because we need to learn how large brands market using the power of the brain as opposed to putting out the same thing everybody else is putting out. And now potential candidates aren't even responding to recruiters at the rate they used to because they're getting inundated.
I
So
was
you
just thinking of that word, inundated. Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, there's a quote from your book that just floored me because it was so true and something I'd never seen anyone kind of say out loud. And I know you said I'll mention one more myth, but I'd like to mention just one more. I think it was from myth number 4. And the quote was, without doing the job of connecting with the candidate and building a relationship, we can't expect to hear answers that are completely truthful. How did you come to this understanding?
So let's think about relationships in general. I mean, let's think about kind of the leader in individual relationship. You know, like recruiting and sales and everything. Leadership, recruiting is all about influence. How do you create influence with somebody? And I'm not talking about manipulation. The difference between
True.
influence and manipulation is intent. If my intent is for me, that's manipulation. If my intent is for them, then I have influence. But let's think about the recruiting process. If I'm, as we talked about earlier, I'm paid just to fill a role, it becomes all about me. When I'm
Mhm.
reaching out to candidates, if I treat them as a human, every human relationship, there's three questions you ask and I ask about the other person. One, do you care about me? So if I come across and I go right to business and I don't get to know that person as an individual, the answer is no, I don't care about you. I'm just trying to fill my role.
Hmm.
The second question we all ask, whether it's subconsciously or not, is, can I trust you? Well, if the first one doesn't connect, the second one probably isn't going to connect. And then the third one we all ask, and this is not meant to be selfish, but is, can you help me? All three of those questions are based on a relationship with a one-on-one individual, whether it's via video or in person, we can have that conversation. But if we don't have those pieces, and I realized this early in my career as a recruiter, where I was given a phone and said recruit, but the stronger the relationship I
Mhm.
built, for Pete's sakes, people, it's human resources. don't suck out of human resources. It's recruiting.
Yeah, think about the human, not the bottom line.
But if we're focused and we're held accountable to something else, we don't have time to, at least this is the thought process of a recruiter or an HR person recruiting, to think about the human.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the 5 Ps for a moment.
Yeah, the 5 Ps were kind of dovetail off of what we were just talking about. And the 5 Ps are really understanding what drives, going back to the head, heart, and the skill set. And there's 5 Ps with everybody. One is, what's my purpose? And I'm not talking about the big philosophical purpose. That's for a different discussion. But what's my purpose in my career? What really drives me? Uncovering that purpose, knowing what somebody's purpose is, you build a stronger connection to that individual, and you can better align them with the right job. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, the people. Who are the people around me that I enjoy working with, that impact me? We've got to, usually purpose ties into the people that I'm doing something with. Once I have purpose in people, there's this idea of process, which is really the 3rd P. How am I going to achieve the goals of this particular role? And once we get to process, it's what's the performance measurements? How am I going to actually get the performance I need through the process and the people that are around me because of the purpose I have and the position I'm trying to go to? And then in the end, if all those align, and this works both for the business and the individual, it comes down to profits. It's what's the profits that the right alignment drives with the business, and what's the profits in terms of income that it drives for the actual individual. Everybody, this is my thought, this has been studied for many, many years, is driven in some form or another by all 5 of those Ps. The trick is understanding what are those 5 Ps in each individual.
Well, how important is authenticity to this new approach that you just mentioned?
I think authenticity has been valuable from the days of originally creating HR and recruiting, right? And people can smell. I hate to use this example, but I'm going to use it. One of the slides I use when I talk about this is I put a picture up of a kind of a slimy looking guy with long hair. And it's kind of what I hate, nothing against my friends in the used car sales business, but it's like, this is what I think about years ago of what a used car salesperson looks like. Now I know that's changed, but you've got this idea of the slimy shyster who's going to do whatever to try to get you to take on that job. Talking, and when I take people through the results-based interviewing, one of the things I talk about is the issues of success in that role. Talking about being authentic. If I came to you, Beth, and I said, Beth, here's the role. Here are the challenges to you being successful in this role. Think about the impact of that. Mm-hmm. 1, I'm being authentic. 2, chances are you're going to say, most of the time, you know what? I've overcome those challenges, and here's how I've done it, and I learned more about you. But we try to have a tendency to say, oh, it's a great place to work, it's a great boss, it's a great environment. That's BS. Not every role.
When it's so vague.
Yes. Where are the particulars, and where is there's a negative side to not negative. There's obstacles to success in every single position.
In your book, you made an excellent point about the importance of a recruiter's communication in this process with the candidate, of course, but also with the hiring manager. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a whole training thing that I do about this relationship of the recruiter with the hiring leader, starting all the way from, how do we create that influence with the hiring leader when we're trying to understand what it is that they're actually looking for. And then what happens is recruiters have a tendency to only want to communicate when things are positive in terms of the process of recruiting. But here's the key piece. One of the things that happens is, think about, again, the model that we were chatting about, where I get incented to fill that role. And it's a little bit performance-based, but a couple of things can happen. If I'm over-incented to fill that role, am I going to oversell the hiring leader on a candidate so I can fill the role and get my commission, or fill the role and get my little check mark if I'm an internal corporate recruiter that I filled the role? I've done my job.
Yeah.
So we've got to be careful about overselling our hiring leaders. What we've got to do is take them back to what are they trying to accomplish with the role and present candidates, communicate that presentation in a way that addresses the specific results of that particular role, not just overselling them on somebody because I want to get my commission. So this whole idea of communicating with the hiring leader is as important, not more, not less, than being able to communicate and understand the candidate. Those same things we know about the candidate, we should know about our hiring leader.
Yeah. Yeah. And presenting candidates in that more comprehensive way puts the recruiter in a better light, kind of showcasing their value too.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. There's so many times that I've sat with recruiters when they're presenting a candidate to a client. And if I were to ask, and I do this, I ask a question about, what's the drive of the candidate? Why is this candidate better than they can't answer it because here's the reality, Beth. They don't know because they didn't have a structured way of truly uncovering it in the first place.
Yep. You nailed it. Yep. Well, that's awesome, Steve. Okay. We're about to take another quick break and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and our guest today is Steve Lowisz, author of Recruiting Sucks, But It Doesn't Have to, Breaking Through the Myths That Got Us Here. We are back. We talked earlier about how the book was inspired by your less than great recruiting experience. Did it also inspire the founding of your company, Qualigens International, as well?
It did. There were some precursors before Qualigens. So as I used agencies earlier in my career to hire for sales and service roles and got burned, in my opinion, had a really horrible experience, I did find an organization that approached recruiting from a different mindset. It wasn't about getting a commission. It was about the right candidate, the right role, the right time, for the right reasons. And their compensation model reflected that. I ended up joining that organization as a partner in the early 90s. And that led me to founding Qualigens in 1999, almost 21 years ago. And it all stemmed from that horrible, horrible experience I had with recruiters early in my career.
Can you tell us a little more about what Qualigens does?
Yeah, there's really three pieces to it. One is this: we still do a lot of recruiting and really in a different model, right? So instead of commission-based, we're really more services-based, like you'd hire an attorney or an accountant to do the work. So recruiting and executive search is in one bucket. The second bucket is really what we call talent optimization. So it's one thing to hire somebody, but it's another thing to get them to perform. I mean, let's think about that for a second. How many times has somebody hired a top performer at company A, they come over to company B, and they fail? The question is, were they dead when they got there, or did you kill them? Right? And I'm using that in a kind of a joking word. Sure. Talent optimization is using analytics and other tools to understand the dynamics. It takes results-based interviewing even further to determine where are we potentially going to have issues. And then the third piece is in a leadership development, sales development, and kind of overall HR development. So think of it as more of an educational piece. So it's let's hire them, let's figure out what's going to make them perform, let's give them the tools to actually perform.
Okay, you referenced results-based interviewing. Does that mean that Qualigens employs the recruitment techniques outlined in your book?
Well, so the answer is kind of.
Yeah, sort of.
And do we train it? Do we follow up? Do most people use it? Yes. Does everybody use it every time? Not until they create a habit of doing it, but they do have to be able to show they have a proficiency in doing it, and we do have some controls in place to try to support that.
Okay. How can our listeners find out more about Qualigens International?
Well, you can do a couple of things. You can go to our website, which is www.qualigens.com, QUALIGENCE.com. You can also look up a lot of our YouTube videos and other social media just by doing a search for Qualigens.
I love the name too, by the way. Do you mind if I ask how you came up with that?
Yeah, it's years ago, we were going to our clients and saying, why do you use us? We were looking for a corporate name. This is back in 1999. And two things came up: the quality of the work we do and the additional intelligence that we provide. So we married the two up.
I love it. Well, and Steve, I don't want to end this conversation without telling people where they can go buy their very own copy of Recruiting Sucks, But It Doesn't Have to. Can you tell us where we can find your book?
Yeah, there's two places you can go. You can go to recruitingsucks.net, or you can just do a search on Amazon. It's in the Amazon store. You can download it from either one.
Perfect. Well, and just so you guys who are listening know, these links and much more will be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to sign up for it today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Steve, it's time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about recruitment. In your opinion, as a recruiter, which of these is the worst interview question? Tell me about yourself. Or, what's your greatest weakness?
What's your greatest weakness?
I agree. What's the best book you've read recently?
Revolutionize Teamwork by Eric Corrywell.
Okay. What's your favorite thing about working in recruitment?
People.
I kind of thought you would say that. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Leadership is not what you get, it's the price you pay.
That's great. Who or what inspires you?
Easy. It's my family. It's my wife and my 2 kids.
Well, it's beautiful. I love that. Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thanks for having me on, Beth.
Yeah, I love talking to you. And also, thanks to our listeners. And as always, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And finally, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, subscribe to the podcast. And while you're there, give us a rating or leave us a review. We love feedback, and we want to make sure we're delivering the kind of content you need. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.